One of the challenges with sustainability is that while people like talking about it, it can be hard to find people driving real impact. But luckily for you, today's guest is someone who is. In this episode of the TechBurst Asia podcast, we will speak to Adrien Desbaillets, the CEO and co-founder of SaladStop, about the growth of his business and how they were able to deliver Southeast Asia's first net zero food and beverage outlet. Adrien Desbaillets, welcome to the TechBurst Asia podcast.
Thanks for having me.
How did I do on that pronunciation? Good. I got to the first part, the hardest part. All right. So, Adrien, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to Singapore?
I'm originally from Switzerland, so born in Switzerland, but grew up in Asia. So most of my life was bouncing around this part of the world. My dad was in the hotel business, so we moved between hotels in the early years, and then he moved into the corporate office in Singapore. So that was my teenage years, and then Singapore's been home ever since. So yeah, I guess fond memories of growing up in this part of the world, very chaotic Southeast Asia. I'm used to the traffic. I'm used to the different cultures and used to adapting to different environments. I guess that's really what I grew up in, having to move every 2 years, changing schools. Yeah, I had a very colorful childhood.
You've been around here for quite a bit in Singapore. And you started SaladStop back in 2009. So can you tell us a bit about how that came about?
Sure. I was based in China at that point, moved back to Singapore, and my dad was also in between consulting gigs. And tail end of the financial crisis, obviously things were still quite up in the air, and we said, let's try to do something. I always had a passion for starting a business, and especially around healthy food. I grew up in a household where my mom made sure that we sort of had a home-cooked meal at the table. Even though we were, again, living in so many different countries, she made it a point that was very important. And I think for me, that connection to food, connection to nature was very important and something that I saw was just missing in Singapore. And I think you could find a salad, but not at least the way we were imagining it. And we challenged ourselves to say, what would it mean to build an Asian salad bar?
And it's interesting because in 2009, I actually moved here from London. So when I lived in London, there was salad places everywhere. But when you came to Asia, there wasn't exactly a lot of healthier places you could go for lunch. Weren't you worried that maybe the market wasn't ready for it?
So I think, we looked at the market, and so my dad and I wrote out a full business plan. As consultants, I guess we actually put pen on paper and we said, well, let's do everything, marketing, finance, build a P&L, looked at the market opportunity, and there weren't many competitors. I would say probably the closest at that point was Subway. And we could see a huge shift. We could see the customer profile changing a lot. I think you had a lot more people moving to Singapore. A lot of the big banks obviously were setting up their corporate offices here. And I think with that, we knew there was an opportunity for 5 to 10 stores just in the downtown area. But what we had to challenge ourselves was, is this model exportable? Are we going to be able to open beyond the shores of Singapore? Because if it was just Singapore, you didn't really have enough scale at that time. So we had to think, well, could it open in Manila or Tokyo or Hong Kong? And that's when we really focused the menu around Southeast Asian flavors and trying to adapt to the local ingredients and as much as possible, appealing to locals. Because we knew expats were going to gravitate towards the concept, but could we convince someone to move from a hawker center to SaladStop?
And this is how you can actually grow, because if you just rely on the expats, there's a limited opportunity. And you've grown quite well since then, I would say. So why don't you walk us through a bit of that growth?
So Marina Square was the first one. And then we opened 5 stores in that first year, 5 in the second. So we knew that the model worked if you could you could benefit from certain economies of scale. And that's why we grew so quickly. We also were able to capture the market, make sure that we built that leading position. And then we really focused on just stabilizing the business in many ways because we grew so quickly, but also looking at how we would then export it. So that's where we started building a lot of our SOPs and looked at refining the concept so that it could open in the Philippines. And that's really was the next big leap for us, was then opening in 7 other markets. Just around that time as well, we completed our Series A. So we brought in a few partners, and I think that really helped us in scaling the business. And just also the mindset, I think, was important to start thinking about how we were going to grow beyond being a family business at that point. And more recently, about 9 months ago, we closed our Series B. And now the business is at 65 stores in 8 markets and looking at building out a lot of new verticals and new capabilities. That is really where we see the future being a lot more digital for us. We see being more of an enabler and a platform rather than just a pure restaurant. And I think that's, for me, what is incredibly exciting after 13 years to see how much the business is evolving.
We've gotten to know each other a bit recently, and what I'm always fascinated by is how much technology does play a role in how you look at the growth of the business and where you want to take it to. And I guess that's probably helped you grow up to these, was it 65 stores now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what are the factors, though, do you think have really contributed to that success?
So I think it's for us still a drive to innovate. I think so in the business as well, my sister Catherine joined us shortly after we started, and my brother-in-law. And I think all of us have this drive to innovate, this curiosity where we are always trying to look at areas to improve the business. And a lot of that right now comes down to technology, because we're really looking at the end of the day, how do we improve the customer experience? And with various digital means, I think we're finding that we can either improve the efficiency of the operation, we can improve the customer experience when they order on our app, or how we just try to communicate more about sustainability message around technology. Technology for us is a great enabler, not replacing any parts of what we do best, but really trying to amplify that. And again, trying to think about what the customer is going to benefit from.
In addition to the technology, since you are providing healthier products for your consumers, has that market changed a lot? Do you have easier access to get locally grown organic vegetables now?
Yeah, a lot. And I think that was a challenge in the early days, especially as we open in some of the neighboring markets to try to find similar ingredients, or at least from a quality perspective. But I think that has changed quite a bit. We were forced in many ways to source locally, which we benefit from today, but also is a big part of the concept. And I guess what the level of transparency as well that we're trying to communicate to our customers. But I think in terms of technology, I think we in the early days looked at it very much from just how we drive a more efficient business. But I think now it's really how do we provide a better customer experience. And I think there are parts of the tech stack that we believe we can do better than anyone else, or that we should be doing, because part of that is just down to the type of experience we want to provide. And if you just take an off-the-shelf solution, that won't work. But I think over the years, we've also seen that just integrating with a lot of those either back-end solutions would allow us to then just focus on what we need to do, which for us really is the customer-facing side of that.
Now, I know one of your passions is around sustainability, and you've been spending a lot of time trying to incorporate that into your SaladStop business. So how has that been progressing?
Yeah, so we opened our first Net Zero store. That's really where a lot of our efforts got culminated into one. And I think over time, we've always been very passionate about sustainability, and that has meant different things over the last 13 years, but I think it still came back to respecting the planet, respecting every ingredient that we sourced, trying to understand where it came from. And for me, even though I grew up very much in that urban environment, every summer we would spend back in Switzerland. And I think for me, that was that connection to nature, seeing my grandfather go and pick the berries, and then my grandmother making that into a tart. Really simple things for a kid growing up in Asia. That was something, again, that my parents made sure that we still had that connection to. So I think when I think about sustainability, I obviously think about that experience I had, but also now moving forward in that sense of urgency about just climate and looking at Singapore and some of the challenges that we will have in Singapore and in the region, and seeing from our perspective how we can help. This F&B industry contributes to 28% of the carbon footprint. So we know we play a huge part of this. I think that store that we opened was an opportunity to bring together a lot of our sustainability initiatives over the years. We were able to work with a lot of different partners. One was Unravel Carbon. So that allowed us to calculate the carbon footprint of the store and also the operational footprint. So actually looking at the source of every ingredient and calculating that. And we worked with a design firm called Pomeroy Studios to look at the carbon footprint of the construction, which we had never done so before. And I think we also wanted to make sure that we had two partners there that could help us validate things. We didn't want to just say, oh, we're a net zero store and then create those numbers ourselves. I think we wanted to make sure we were working with experts here to go through that process. And I think that process was a very important part. So for us, and that was a big milestone. Obviously, that's just the beginning of it, because now we see already all the opportunities and gaps where we want to improve. But it is our commitment to saying, look, we have a store that's in a way a living lab for us. We get to experiment, but it's also us taking a very clear position on where we stand in terms of sustainability, what that means for customers, how transparent we want to be.
And I think it's quite impressive how transparent you have been with this, because you seem to be talking quite a bit about how you've achieved this net zero store. And we should mention, it's not just Singapore's first. This is Southeast Asia's first F&B outlet that is net zero. But now you're also saying you want to have all of your outlets be net zero by 2030. So what kind of challenges do you think you're going to run into trying to achieve that?
Right.
And also, is the market really ready for it? Because we sit down and we've talked about sustainability a lot.
That's right.
Is the market really ready for this? And are they willing to pay a premium if it comes with it?
And I think, if you look at a lot of the data sets out there, 2/3 of customers are basically willing to support the purpose-driven brand, right? So I think that's quite clear. And especially post-COVID, I think people really are passionate about that. And I think that's really resonating for them with brands that stand for something. So I think on our end with sustainability, we do realize that sustainability means something different in every one of the markets we operate. So in Indonesia, they really will be looking more at plastic and how Indonesia is the second biggest plastic consumer in the world, right? So I think that's a huge problem for them. In the Philippines, they're really supporting the local farms. That's for them. Farm to table is very important. So I think the way we tell the story is different, but I think it still comes down to working through a whole process that gets you a certain point, right? I think net zero is just a good benchmark for us because in Singapore actually was the most challenging to source materials locally, to build things here, to take recycled plastic, turn those into tiles, take fallen trees, turn those into tables, work with Deliveroo to make that a carbon neutral delivery. That really brought a lot of partners together and I think showed that you can be an F&B operation, you can be an SME, but you can still have that impact. And I think for us, 2025, we want to have all stores in Singapore to be net zero, and in 2030 to have all of our stores worldwide to be net zero. And that means basically every time a store comes up to renovations, we would turn that into another net zero outlet. In other markets, it again means working with local partners on finding materials, working through the whole supply chain, and again, constantly trying to improve on that.
And I can understand why Singapore would be a challenge because you can buy materials that will help you achieve your goals. But if they come from Australia and they have to get shipped here, there goes all of the benefits you'd be getting out of it. So Singapore doesn't exactly have a lot of huge industries that can support this. So how is that industry progressing? Are you seeing them make good progress? And you said, did they get fallen trees from Singapore and you were using them?
That's right. Yeah. So we found a company called Roger & Sons that do exactly that. So they work with the local national parks. And I think the construction industry is starting to just at least ask the questions, right? What materials are we using? Are we able to source something different? Are we able to repurpose something? And that's where I think even as we look at how we forward with our own construction, it is about making them more modular. So meaning that if a store were to be renovated, we could break that down and potentially reuse it. And even a lot of our carbon footprint from an operational perspective just comes down to how we operate, the type of lighting we use, the type of air conditioning. So working with the landlords, how we're sourcing our ingredients, working with the whole supply chain, not about just reaching our store as that was transported, what sort of packaging it was in, and etc. So our business is quite complex. Obviously, we have so many moving parts, but I think as we've seen, and this is again what we've always believed in, is with scale comes impact. And I think we have enough scale at this point that we can actually take these steps.
Another thing I like talking about is how you bring customers along this journey. And with sustainability, it can be difficult because people like the idea of it, but then they're not always ready if there's extra costs associated with it. But how do you plan out your journey for your customers? How do you bring them along? Make sure they're educated and understand what you're doing, why you're doing, and the benefit that's actually going to deliver back to them and to the planet.
That's a great question. I think that's really where we're now focused on taking this living lab that we have and where we get to experiment and see the customer's reaction based on the materials they're seeing and the images on the screens, and seeing what is resonating and how do we engage with them? Because that is still the part that we're going to need to break that barrier, right? If a customer walks in today into the Net Zero store, they'll give us thumbs up, well done, SaladStop. We support you. We're right behind you. We'll choose you over competitor, et cetera, right? But now we really want to find a way to engage them on a much deeper level. And what we have found is that the easiest entry point is focusing on their health, then the health of the community. And that obviously then leads to the health of the planet, right? So I think if we just say, okay, this ingredient is good for you for XYZ, and it is sourced from a local farm in Singapore that has double the amount of antioxidants in their kale, and by the way, it's using 90% less water, that is a sort of a natural progression, right? We are obviously very fortunate that we have a product that fits that quite well, and we can obviously tell a story. But I think if you start with the customer first and let them go along that journey with you, that's what we're focused on. And that's why a big part of our technology also is around these 3 pillars and how we build that journey for the customer.
Now, what's next for SaladStop? Because you've been growing quite a bit. You've just gone through your Series B about 9 months ago.
Yeah.
So what's the future plans? Is it to grow more in Singapore, grow more internationally, or move into other sectors?
So for us, it's really deepening our footprint. I think we're already in most of the Southeast Asian markets and see just massive opportunities in this part of the world. And so that is a natural extension of the business. It is what we have been working on for many years. So that is what the team is focused on. And over the next 2 or 3 years, where we will put a lot of our resources towards. But we also want to make sure that we're building for the future. And a big part of that is on the technology front. I think we believe that we can be a little bit more of a platform beyond just a physical restaurant. And we get to work with so many cutting edge businesses now, from food tech, agri-tech, and Singapore is becoming that hub for innovation around this space. So we get to play with plant-based proteins, cell-based meats, and that is incredibly exciting, trying to have Singapore be the R&D hub and then take that internationally. So that is really what I think fuels us right now, and I think is an incredibly exciting part of the business.
So you've been running this business now for 13 years, which means I'm sure you had to learn a lot by just testing things out. And you've probably had some feelings and you learned from that, but then you had a lot of successes as well. So I'm going to ask you for some advice. Say that somebody wants to start out running a business in the F&B sector. What advice would you give them up front?
So I think the first one, I think one of the most important steps we took is really identifying our target audience. We were very clear about the product we were going to serve. And then along the way, yes, we adapted it a little, but we also made sure that we stayed to a certain core. And I think in the F&B industry, at least, I see a lot of people starting off with a good product, but then they go into too many different directions. So that would be the first. I think the second is humility. I think is really being able to always keep your eyes and ear open, making sure that you want to learn, you're curious. And I think that is what drives a lot of innovation. I think if you're just very open-minded, you're taking feedback from your own team as well. I think that is a big part of also what we believe in, and staying humble. And I think lastly, I would say is as entrepreneurs, managing your own energy levels. I think that is tough, because as you scale companies, you need to make sure that you focus your energies in the right time, in the right way. And that is something I've learned over the years as well, trying to make sure that you're in for the long run. And I think that long game is, I think, also something that, a lot of businesses through different parts of their journey, I think, need to understand. And I think the entrepreneurs leading that need to make sure they can manage it.
Okay. And then what about on the funding side? Because you've had to go through 2 different rounds of funding right now. What have you learned in that process? And what advice would you give somebody who's got to go out there and pitch to a VC to try and get funding?
So I think the landscape has changed quite a bit in the last few months.
Yeah.
But at least when we closed our Series B, I think, and Series A as well, I think it was, about being authentic as much as you can. I think really making sure that you understand your business. And I think COVID was in a way a blessing for us in disguise, because we got to spend some time in Singapore and actually just think about our business and strategize for the long run. And I think that allowed us to look within, making sure that we approached the right VCs and that they were value aligned, right? And I think that was a very important part of the criteria. We knew that slightly more long-term investors were the right ones for us, also having partners that would value add to the business. So I think that's important as well. I think being quite clear about who you're going to approach, and then making sure that obviously you've got a good deck together, that you've got all the right foundations.
Yep. And finally, on the sustainability side, what have you learned along that process? Because being the first mover in trying to create this net zero store, you had to learn, and it's like you go and copy what somebody else did. No one's really done it here before. So what did you learn across that process, and what advice would you give to somebody who wants to set up a net zero carbon store?
So I think it's, like you said, everybody sort of defines sustainabilities in different ways. And I think that's where we're at. And it's good, because I think everyone is exploring, asking a lot of questions about what sustainability means to them. And I think that's, as a business, you have to identify what it means to you, because ultimately you need the team and the people around you to believe in that vision as well, right? And to stand behind it and live and breathe it every day. So that's where I think for us, it's quite clear what that means to us and how we framed it internally. So I would say that's for every business what they should look at is, okay, what part of the sustainability journey do we need to be on? And then how's that going to be communicated to customers?
Okay. Now, I also know that you have passions outside of sustainability and SaladStop. And one of those is around wearables. 'Cause I'll never forget the first time I met you. You were wearing an Oura ring on your finger. You had your Apple Watch on. And then you were also wearing a lumen sensor on your arm. And I remember just asking you why all the different devices. So like, what information are you getting out of these? Why are you testing out the wearables? Or what information do you wish you could get from these?
Yeah. So again, it goes back to learning and being curious. I guess I'm always fascinated by all these pieces of technology and what you can gather from that. And that's, I guess, what we see now is we see a huge amount of data being gathered, but a lot of customers don't necessarily know what to do with that. When we talk about food, they might be able to cook a meal and buy those ingredients at the supermarkets, or they might be able to get supplements. But how do you translate that into your everyday breakfast, lunch, dinner? And that's really the problem we're trying to solve. How do we become that translation and operational layer in this whole ecosystem? And that it is an ecosystem. I think these are different parts that need to work together to ultimately bring value to the customer. And I think that's what is starting to shape. It's still a wide open field, but I'm very excited about it because the potential to really personalize an experience could be incredible here.
And this is what I'm hoping it actually gets to, because I know on your app, you track a lot of information about all the different ingredients that are going in there. So you can get a good understanding of what's going in. If you can then combine that with data that comes across maybe a consumer wearable like an Apple Watch, but then maybe if someone's wearing a medical grade wearable that would capture different information, we can start getting a much more holistic view of our personal health and almost create a personal digital twin.
That's right. And I think the one piece, and I think this is where we're very aware of this, is that you need to have that element of trust that sits very firmly in the middle. That is the piece that we're going to always use as our North Star, is that we have built a lot of trust with our customers. We have incredible stickiness. They do trust us today, but we can't take that for granted, especially when we get into data, personalizing offerings to them. It needs to be real. It needs to be authentic. It needs to be trustworthy.
It is funny you mentioned that about the stickiness you have with your customers, because when I told a few of my friends that I was going to be talking to you today, they all have their story. They all talk about, I used to go to this branch, and they all have their favorite either salad or wrap that they would always eat. So you have done a good job of building that up over the years. But now I'm going to ask you a tricky question to close out, because you've been very successful with SaladStop. I'm with sustainability. But now let's say that you have to start a new business today. It can be anything, but it can't be in the F&B business. What would you want to go into and why?
So I think I don't necessarily have a specific industry in mind. I think for me, I do love creating things. So seeing a concept come to life is what I'm passionate about. So I'm more of a builder. I don't think I'd necessarily be an investor. I think I like to get my hands dirty, work with people. And I think whatever form that business takes, I think hopefully it can be an enabler. It can be a platform. I think obviously the world has changed quite a bit over the last 13 years. We started with a model that was tested, especially in the US. Salad bars were around New York and San Francisco, LA. So we could see that already. But today, I guess the way technology plays a role in all of that and how you can scale businesses, again, very different. So I would love to bring all those passions together again, in what form that takes. Hopefully in this part of the world, I see, again, huge opportunity, but also huge potential for impact. And I think it comes at such a critical time. I think these markets are obviously booming. There's a rising middle class, but there's also so much appetite to learn and change. And I think when we operate in these markets, it's incredibly exciting. When I go to Indonesia or I go to Bangkok and speak to young people there, gives you a lot of hope. But it also makes you realize that, wow, this is the opportunity that we need to seize in terms of the change that we need to make. This is the next generation of people that will ultimately fight climate change and bring us towards the next 30 to 50 years.
And the process you're going through right now, where you're bringing them on that journey and educating them on why it's important, I think does add a lot of impact and a lot of value back. So I want to congratulate you on all the success that you've had.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you very much for joining us on the TechBurst Asia podcast. And hopefully you'll come back and see us sometime when you started that new business. And considering how much you love technology, you love platforms, and you love wearables, I hope it's somewhere in that space, because then you can link this whole ecosystem together.
Would love to. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the TechBurst Asia podcast. If you liked the episode, please do click like and subscribe. And if you didn't, well, you probably didn't make it this far anyway. Talk to you next time on the next episode of the TechBurst Asia podcast.